what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Welcome back to the Seeds of Revolution. We have a wonderful author interview for you this week. We're talking to Eve Rickert. Eve is a co-author with Andrea Zanin of More Than Two, Cultivating Non-Monogamous Relationships with Kindness and Integrity. Eve, thanks so much for joining Seeds of Revolution.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe we can start out by you giving me just a thumbnail sketch of your background, your qualifications, and how you came to write about non-monogamy.
Okay. So my background is I have been, so I think that I have been non-monogamous my whole life, although I have not always lived that as a lifestyle. I have been in monogamous relationships, but they were always relationships where monogamy kind of didn't make sense to me, I think, at one level or another. And so, but I would say that I sort of officially became non-monogamous in 2004 when my then husband and I decided that we were going to open our marriage. And we went through a sort of fairly, normative, I guess, process of opening our marriage. First we looked into swinging and visited a couple swingers clubs. And then we were like, that's not for us. And so we started looking into hierarchical polyamorous dating, discovered that wasn't for us.
Can I ask you what you mean by, I'm going to do this a lot in this interview. What is hierarchical polyamorous dating?
No, I'm happy to talk about it. This was the mid-aughts, and I think that this was the predominant, at least the most visible way of doing polyamory at the time, where you had, a primary partner, and then you dated people who were your secondary partners, and the primary partner often had veto or could set limits or make rules. Once we actually got into relationships, we realized, like, just almost right away, like, ew, that doesn't work for us. Like, we don't want to be making those kinds of rules for the other relationships. These are real people. Like, that doesn't feel good. But there wasn't a lot of material out there at the time on how to do it differently, because there weren't a lot of books at the time, and everything there was very focused on using that language and that kind of structure.
That hierarchical
structure.
The
hierarchical structure. So around, I'm moving past my background and getting into the writing of the book, if that's okay.
Sure, no problem. We can always get back and forth.
I mean, you asked about my qualifications, and I would say that my qualifications are really just lived experience. A lot of observation, a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and a lot of reading. So I don't have any academic qualifications in this field. I have a master's degree in environmental studies. So and I'm a publisher. So I think both Andrea, my co-author, and I tried really hard in this book not to position ourselves as any kind of experts. This is more sort of a philosophical and practical deep dive into what we've learned over our lifetimes and what might be useful to other people.
When I was reading parts of it, that's one of the things I was really impressed about, is it seemed like you really did want to focus on the practical side of helping people, like you say, cultivating these relationships and navigating what I imagine are some, treacherous emotional waters when you're involved in non-monogamous and polyamorous relationships.
Yeah.
When did you decide to write a book about it? When did you decide to go from practicing to writing?
I would say it was an idea that developed sort of between maybe 2009 and 2011-ish. And it was largely as a result of not finding things in the existing literature, either in books or really online very much at the time, that resonated with kind of what my own values were in relationships and the way I was finding them playing out in my own polycule. So for those who don't know, a polycule is like you and your network of intimate relationships. And so in 2011, I started a blog. I still have it, though it's not very active, at brighterthansunflowers.com. And I just started, sharing my thoughts and my experiences. And I thought, well, if I develop a following, if people like this, then eventually I'm going to start working on a book. And then in 2012, I met someone else who was also a non-monogamous blogger, someone I'd been following for a while, who also talked about non-hierarchical polyamory and whose views I respected. We ended up falling in love, getting in a relationship, and he also wanted to write a book. And so I was like, well, you want to write a book? I want to write a book. Why don't we do this thing together? And we both shared co-creation as a love language. And so that was a really exciting idea. And so we crowdfunded it, we created an LLC based in Portland called Thorntree Press, which was initially to hold the crowdfunding money and then produce the book. Had no intentions of starting a publishing company. Weren't sure how the book was going to go, was going to do, but it ended up really exploding in popularity over a couple of years and very quickly became sort of the go-to. I hate this phrase, but there were people who were calling it the polyamory Bible, but it was
Why do you hate that phrase?
Well, it's just because I don't like it being positioned as a source of authority or, something that you should it was never, for me, it was never intended to be, the idea of a Bible is something that's kind of handed down on high or channeled. And I didn't want it to be, I wanted my contributions to be a contribution to the conversation. And I feel for a long time, maybe it did kind of carry too much of a sense of weight or authority, as opposed to something that could spark ideas and thinking and self-reflection. So the second edition came about because I will invite people to Google the history of this if you want. I don't like to talk about it anymore myself. So I'll just skim over it. But my first co-author and I, we split up. It was very acrimonious. I will say that the Thorntree Press did become an ongoing publishing company. We published Polysecure is probably our best known book.
Is that one you also wrote, Polysecure?
I did not write Polysecure. That was by Jessica Fern. And I co-authored the foreword to that book. But so after the breakup, I eventually was able to acquire full rights to Thorntree Press, brought it to Canada, rebranded it as Thornapple Press and as a Canadian publishing company. And then a couple of years after that, we reached an agreement that allowed me to purchase copyright to more than two. So then by that time, a lot of the shine, I think, had worn off the first edition. People were criticizing it a lot more. The world had changed. The non-monogamous world had changed. Some of the things that were, maybe groundbreaking in the first couple of years after it were much more norms. And then people were starting to see how those could also cause harm. And so I really wanted a version of the book that didn't have my ex's involvement. And so it was quite important for me to issue a new edition, significantly revised, as much of his influence scrubbed as possible, as much of my new learning in the last decade incorporated into the book. And I did end up involving a co-author, a new co-author who I'd worked with at that point for 5 years, as they are an editor for Thornapple. And so initially they came in as an editor, but as that relationship developed, it became obvious pretty quickly that they needed to be a co-author. And that ended up being a really lovely collaboration and synthesis of two very different. What's nice about that collaboration is we have very similar politics, but very different life experiences. So we were able to kind of synthesize those different life experiences, but we had a shared lens to bring to the book as far as our values. So we ended up revising probably, I would say like 90 to 95% of the book is either new text or heavily reworked text. So it is a very, like, people who've read the first edition will find the core of what was, I hope, what was good about the first edition there. The bones are there, but so much of it has been reworked. And one of the things that was really striking to us as we were revising was how much our own views have changed. And, how much more we've learned and read. And, both of us are 10 years older. And so, yeah, that's...
When somebody buys your book and they're looking to, cultivate non-monogamy,
mm-hmm.
and they maybe have only previously been in a monogamous relationship, or they're brand new to non-monogamy, and I don't want to ask you to take the important parts of your book out, because that infers that there's unimportant parts. But, if somebody's really looking for some banner headlines, things I should do first to cultivate a kind and loving non-monogamous relationship, what's the top 2 or 3 or 4 or 5?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I will say, like, we're sitting here with it so people can't see it, but it is a 500-page book.
It is.
So it is and there's a lot in there that's about, I think that would be useful even in monogamous relationships or in exclusive relationships. And we did try to make it inclusive of a wide variety of non-monogamy, including relationship anarchy, solo poly, people who are asexual or aromantic, and so on. And there are sections in there. There's a section on opening from a couple, because that is a common scenario, but though by no means the only one. There's a section on monopoly relationships where one person's monogamous and one's non-monogamous. But those are, pieces of the book. 1 or 2 things. I mean, so chapter 2 is our chapter on ethics, and it's subtitled "Don't Be Mean."
And I have notes about that, because I thought that was such a wonderful. Yeah, I've read that chapter, and I thought it was really wonderful, and that was such a wonderful way of phrasing it.
Yeah, and I will say, first of all, that was originally Andrea's contribution, and it is neither one of us coined that. It's a quote from. If you hand me the book, I can tell you who the quote is from, because "Don't Be Mean" comes from a quote by Kate Bornstein in the book Hello, Cruel World. But
I wanted to read that quote. I have it in my notes.
Sure.
So the quote is, "Over the course of this book, I will be giving you permission to do anything you want to do, anything at all, short of killing yourself. I don't care if it is illegal, immoral, fattening, self-defeating, whatever, as long as it isn't mean to anyone." So number 1, shout out to W.C. Fields for the illegal, immoral, and fattening line. Why, it's so simple, but why do you think that's so important? That simple guideline, don't be mean.
Oh, well, I mean, 1, because, as we say in the book, like, it's simple, but it's deceptively complicated, right? Because then you have to really think about, well, what is mean? What makes something mean or not? Am I being mean right now, or am I setting a boundary? And so I think it's a simple way of focusing your attention on how you want to treat other people. But behind that, there's a great deal of stuff going on.
Is there a difference between not being mean in a monogamous relationship and not being mean in a non-monogamous relationship?
I don't really think so. I think that maybe non-monogamy offers you a few more flavors of meanness.
Or opportunities
to choose from.
To be mean.
Yeah. But I think that, hurting people for the sake of hurting people, which may not necessarily be malicious. It may be because you're hurt and you want them to feel the same thing, or you want their empathy. And so that's the quickest way you feel like you can get it. A lot of people do that, right? That's just one example. Like, that's mean. It's mean to say something or do something just to try to get someone else to feel hurt. It's common. And yeah, I mean, I think that like you can do that in any kind of relationship, friendships, working relationships, family relationships. And in fact, people do that all the time, just for example.
What, in your experience, because you obviously have experienced both in monogamous and non-monogamous relationships, going from a monogamous relationship to a non-monogamous relationship, in your experience, which maybe other listeners and readers will relate to, what were the most challenging parts of making that transition?
Mm-hmm. For us, it was a long transition. And I think that we were fortunate in one way in that we sort of came to the realization at the same time that we both wanted non-monogamy. And so I can't even remember who raised the issue first, but it was like, yeah, we want to do that. So there was never a sense that one person was sort of like pulling the other person along. I would say that, and I want to be cautious here as well. In the first edition of the book, I was very self-disclosing. There are a lot of personal stories and anecdotes. All of those were taken out of this edition for a variety of reasons. The main one being we decided that they just didn't add anything, but another reason being that I had kind of had my personal life on public display for 10 years at that point, and I was just done with it, you know? And so I'm reluctant to kind of get too far into personal narrative. And I also, I'm not with he's now my ex-husband, and I just want to respect his privacy. But I would say that, for my part, I did have a tendency to neglect our relationship when I was in a new relationship, when I was in love with someone new. And I know that was very, very painful, to him. I, recently had an experience where a similar thing happened to me. And I was just like, wow, like, I don't really believe in the universe sending people messages, but I sort of feel like the universe is trying to send me a message so that I can experience this side of things and know what this felt like and like really, empathize. So, and I think that that's a common, I mean, to try to be generous towards my former self, I think that that's a really common thing that people do. Well, it doesn't make it okay, but
maybe I can rephrase, because I'm sure you've heard from readers, many readers.
Mm-hmm.
When you hear from your readers, what do they find the most challenging about moving from monogamy to non-monogamy?
I think that the most challenging, because there are so many things, and it really depends on who you are. There is, I think, I don't know if I can pick the most challenging, so I'll just pick something that like really sticks out for me, which is that we have we talk a lot in More Than Two about mononormativity, which is this whole set of like societal ideas about what a good relationship is. It's tied in with things like the relationship escalator, which are the sort of presumed progression of steps that any relationship will go through. It's tied in with amatonormativity, which tells us that romantic love is like the best and most important kind of love and should be sort of like an ideal that we all need it in our lives to have a fulfilling life. It's tied in with heteronormativity, and the gender binary. There are very compelling stories that most people in our culture have been taught from a very early age that tell us that if our partner loves someone else, it means they love us less, that our relationship is less important.
It's a zero-sum game.
Yeah, that it's a zero-sum game, that there's something wrong with us, there's something wrong with our love, that it's somehow less, that we're going to lose them. Now, to be clear, in some cases, that happens, right? So, it's quite common for example, people to open up an unsatisfying relationship, hoping that the non-monogamy will make it satisfying, but in fact, it just shines a light on how unsatisfying it is, and then you end up losing that relationship. It's common to actually lose a partner, and they go often to be with another partner. Like that happens. So it's not like these are irrational fears. But so I'm not talking about that, like, because I don't want to, like, people need to be kind of attuned to what their gut is telling them about what's really happening in their relationship. But these stories and unpacking these stories and the influence that they have on how we view ourselves and how we view our relationships is very difficult work. And I think it's lifelong work because those stories are constantly being reiterated to us. So that's Jessica Fern in her third book, Polywise, talks about the polyamorous paradigm shift, I think is what she calls it. And it's really just about that. Like it's so much more than just, dating and finding other partners and dealing with your jealousy while your partner's with someone else. Like, you really kind of end up having to remake your whole way of thinking about relationships. And that's really hard work.
So it sounds to me like for some people who think of non-monogamy as a simple answer to some yearnings they might have in a monogamous relationship, it's actually not so simple. Like, if you're looking to simplify your relationship.
I mean, non-monogamy is a very broad term. Yeah. And I would say that there are certain kinds of depending on what need you're trying to fulfill, there are certain kinds of non-monogamy that are more simple than others. So if the need is really for sexual adventure and variety, you might find that swinging is exactly what you need. And I'm not going to say that swinging is simple, but I think that it is designed to be as simple as it can be while still being non-monogamy. So swinging is, in the most narrow sense of the term, is usually, couples engaging with other couples or groups of couples or at parties, often playing together or watching each other play. It's kind of seen as a couple activity. And so it is very much, there are kind of taboos around like forming emotional relationships that are too deep with the people you swing with. And so like, and I know if there are swingers listening to me, I want to acknowledge there is a much broader sort of pool of what is called swinging, and that's getting broader all the time. But the most, I would say, like kind of the longest standing and most conventional variety of it is what I'm talking about, and you can still find pools of that. So that can, for some people, be a really great way to get the sexual adventure they need and variety, and also spice up their own sex life. But if you are trying to do like particularly like non-hierarchical, networked polyamory, where you have multiple emotional, romantic, intimate relationships, particularly if you're trying to have more than one relationship where you're cultivating attachment, no, that's not at all simple. And I would also say that, like, even if you're swinging, you can find yourself falling in love and suddenly find yourself in a much less simple situation.
That's interesting that you can say find yourself falling in love, because the story that we're told, or the story that I often heard, and maybe this is not true, is that when you start engaging in sexual relationships with other partners, one of the reasons it becomes complicated is because for a lot of people, the mere sexual act tends to trigger these emotions. Mm-hmm. So you start off, when you're starting off in something like a swinging relationship or non-monogamous relationship, even if you want to confine it to something that's mostly physical, it can become emotional quicker and more emotional than you might have been anticipating. Mm-hmm. Am I correct, or am I way off?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I just want to acknowledge just the huge variation in people's sort of sexual and romantic orientations, and I mean, asexuality is not an orientation, but they're sort of the way people are wired. So for many people, that is true. For many people, sex leads to attachment, leads to feels. For other people, it doesn't. And I think what gets us into trouble is when people are maybe not self-aware about how they operate, or think that they can control how they operate, and think that, oh, well, it's just sex, so I'll just, maintain these boundaries and I'm not going to fall in love. I think that's how like a lot of people got into secondary relationships, thinking like, oh, I'll be okay with that. Like I'll just, and well, then you get into it and it's not okay. But then like I'm demisexual. So,
What does that mean?
so, the definition of demisexuality that I subscribe to, and I think there are a few varieties of it that kind of dance around a similar thing, but the one I use is that I experience secondary sexual attraction, but not primary sexual attraction. So primary sexual attraction is like you meet someone or you like, go on a date with someone and you immediately are like, oh, this person is hot. I would want to sleep with this person. And the secondary attraction is when you've known someone for a while, you start to care about them, have an intimate connection with them, and an attraction develops over time. So for a lot of people, primary sexual attraction is how they get into a relationship. And then that often fades over time, but the secondary attraction develops and sort of replaces it with that more like kind of intimate kind of attraction. But I tend to not get the first thing. I tend to only develop the second thing, which means that, first of all, I just cannot do dating. Like, it just doesn't work for me because like I could sit down with someone, at a date zero at a coffee and be like, I have no idea if I'm going to want to have sex with you in 6 months because like, it also means that most of my relationships have developed out of most of my sexual relationships have developed out of other kinds of longer established relationships, friendships or social relationships, that sort of thing. So that was one reason that swinging just didn't work for me, because I was like, none of these people are remotely, I know nothing about them. Therefore, I feel no attraction to a single person here. So, yeah. So I have to have the emotional connection first.
What, and I don't mean to phrase this in a way that's demeaning at all to your book, because I think it's a great book and it's 500 pages full of some really great information. How much of the book is the idea that you need to be honest with your partner and partners, and sort of reiterating that idea and placing it in different contexts and emphasizing it in different ways?
I mean, there are certain, again, in chapter 2, we talk about the values, our values, and then the values that underpin the whole book. And honesty is one of those values. And so it's certainly something that we come back to over and over again. I couldn't say how much of the book is that, but I think it's just like a number of things.
And I guess I didn't mean
just,
like
it's like a thread that kind of runs through the whole book.
I didn't mean it as in terms of, quantify what percentage of your book.
Right.
But I guess when I'm thinking, from my perspective, I'm thinking about how I would begin to navigate these relationships. It seems to me, as a non-expert who knows nothing about it, that honesty would be sort of like the lodestone for so many other, not rules, but guidelines.
Yeah, for sure. And the four values that underpin the whole book that we describe are consent, agency, honesty, and responsibility. And of course, honesty kind of underpins all three of those, because you really can't have all of those functioning fully if you don't have honesty.
What do you mean by agency and responsibility?
So agency is, I kind of want you to give me the book so I can, I'm curious whether I can define it off the bat here, but so it's interesting. It looks like we don't actually define agency and responsibility right there in the book. So it's an interesting question, but I would say that agency comes down to your ability to make choices for yourself, and to make empowered choices, which includes having the information that you need to make those choices. And it also includes being free from coercion, which of course is also part of our definition of consent. And there, to some extent, agency is kind of balanced by responsibility, because responsibility comes down to sort of what do you owe other people? And that is a very, very personal decision, right? That's very personal. That's grounded in your own values and ethics. And it's, what do I owe? What do I owe you sitting in front of me? What do I owe someone I walk past on the street? What do I owe my mother or my romantic partner or my friends? Is very entwined with personal values and ethics. And we actually include a number of questions in this book on sort of helping you focus and define your own ethical system. Because I think that one of the things that really that really derails people in relationships is when we actually run into different assumptions about what we owe each other. What are our responsibilities to each other?
You mean partners not being on the same page in terms of their obligations and
what even
desire.
does I think it's worth asking each other, what does responsibility look like to you? Because it's I think there are a lot of people who would like to reject the idea that we even do owe each other anything, that we do have obligations to each other, and I disagree with that. And because I think that we all have responsibilities to each other as humans, as part of society. I think that this is also an underlying idea of anarchism, if I'm not wrong on that.
For sure.
But where do those responsibilities begin and end? And especially in intimate relationships it's very tricky. And so, for example, what's my responsibility to resolve conflict with you? What's my responsibility to hold space for your feelings, even if maybe I'm getting activated or I'm feeling attacked? What's my responsibility to communicate my feelings in a way that doesn't make you feel attacked? What's my responsibility after the relationship ends to try to offer closure, to offer processing of that? Those are all. I have very strong feelings about what my responsibilities are. And something I am learning about myself is that I need to seek out people who share my values in that. And a mismatch of those core values, I think, has been at the root of some of my biggest conflicts in both intimate relationships and friendships. So,
speaking about anarchy,
mm-hmm.
I found that quote that we read from that other author was a very sort of anarchist sentiment, giving people permission to do anything they want as long as it's not illegal, immoral, fattening, or self-defeating.
No, well, she said you could do any of that.
Oh, sorry. Yes. If it is illegal, immoral, fattening, and self-defeating, regardless of that fact, giving ourselves and others permission to do anything they want. Am I wrong in thinking that that's a pretty anarchistic sentiment?
So I can't speak as an expert on anarchism. So I would defer to you on that.
Anarchism.
Right. I would say that is a relationship anarchist sentiment for sure. Yeah.
Given that, I know that you got a good response at the Victoria Anarchist Book Fair to your book. And I'm sure people came up to you afterwards and during your actual panel discussion. Was there a discussion about the intersection between non-monogamy and anarchism?
There wasn't. No, there was a question that came up about relationship libertarianism, which is sort of, I think a lot of people, that's something discussed in the book as well. We read that passage at the book fair, but a lot of people who identify as relationship anarchists are, I think, actually closer to a relationship libertarian.
What does that mean?
Well, I think it's where you take out the responsibility to others.
You just do whatever you want to do.
Yeah. So,
do you find it, and do other people? And I know the answer. Well, part of the answer is going to be everybody's experience is different. In general, do you find it, or do your readers find it challenging to navigate the outside world as a non-monogamist, as somebody who is polyamorous, separate and apart from, the internal dynamic when you go home for Thanksgiving, when you talk to your friends at the bar about who you're dating.
Mm.
I would imagine that's probably more challenging.
Yeah. So speaking to my own experience, it was certainly more challenging kind of in the early years. I lost a lot of friends. And once I wrote a book and came out, like I fully came out as much as you can possibly be out, because my name was on a book that sold almost 200,000 copies. And it actually got a lot easier for me because, after, I lost and grieved those friendships, but then anyone new who came into my life already knew up front exactly what I was about. And so was at least okay with that. It's just not been an issue. I, in the last 13 years, I mostly have just been self-employed, but there was a period of a couple of years where I was employed by someone else, and I was upfront, at the beginning, like, if you Google me, this is what you will find. Is that okay? And they were like, yeah, it's fine. So I didn't have to worry about being out of work. So, the hard part for me is, honestly, it's what there are moments when I still come up against mononormative thinking when I'm not expecting it. And I have come up against it in intimate relationships where someone actually was working in a monogamous paradigm, even though I had understood that we were non-monogamous.
And I would imagine you'd been explicit about it.
Well, yeah, and I had been explicit. And by working in a monogamous paradigm, I'm actually not talking about sort of expecting exclusivity or anything like that, but I'm talking about just like the norms around dating and what you disclose and what you don't and what's okay and what's not. And sort of, so that whole like breaking down of the monogamous paradigm was just something that I think they hadn't done. And it came up in ways that I wasn't expecting. But then you mentioned, readers, and I will say, like, I can just talk about people I know, right? I don't know if they read my book or not, but for people who, I would say that I have a lot of privilege in a lot of ways to be able to be as out as I am. And most people do not have that level of privilege. And so, certainly I know people who have experienced discrimination at work, who have experienced family estrangement, who have had non-monogamy brought up in custody battles. The world is still pretty hostile generally to people who, as much acceptance as we've gotten, as much representation slowly as we've managed to get, there's still a lot of hostility towards us.
I find that mind-boggling, and I'm sure this has to do with my monumental naivete. Mm. But to me, if we were coworkers or we were friends, who you sleep with makes no impact on how I view you as a worker or how I view our friendship, unless it's obviously we're talking about our relationships as part of sharing our lives together. But, and maybe this is a question you can't answer for these people, but why would people find the fact that you're non-monogamous so threatening, especially in a workplace environment where I have a feeling it probably doesn't even come up that much?
Well, I mean, it depends on the workplace too, right? Like if you're a teacher, for example, and if you're a teacher in someplace like, I don't know, Chilliwack or Abbotsford, where things are a bit more conservative, or, like it's, or really anything to do with kids. Of course, you're way more likely to experience discrimination.
Would people equate non-monogamy with some sort of predatory behavior?
Well, sure, yeah,
that's crazy.
Well, and I mean the same way they equate queerness or gender nonconformity, like it's so
crazy.
Yeah, so that's the first thing that comes to mind, and then just people living in conservative areas, and then there's other ways that you can encounter it as well, like if your friend group is not versed in non-monogamy or not fully accepting of it, and you're having problems in one of your relationships, there can be a tendency to blame everything on the non-monogamy. Like, well, what did you expect? Like, I even remember hearing that With a partner of mine, he mentioned to a friend that he was struggling in one of his relationships, and they were like, "Oh, well, but what do you expect living the lifestyle you do?" I was just like, "Whoa." So, so it can be hard to get, empathy. It can be hard to get balanced advice because people are always kind of pointing to this weird deviant thing that you're doing. Or they just assume that there's going to be drama and you're going to be hurt. And so, what do you expect? So, yeah.
Do you feel like there's a cultural or political shift that is slowly starting to be more accepting of non-monogamous lifestyles?
Yes. I mean, I would pretty much everyone knows what it is now, right? Like if you were to say polyamory or even polycule, you don't have to explain words like that anymore. And I think that it's much more common as just one option among many, and especially among younger folks. I think that it's more common to, rather than assuming monogamy as a default, to have a conversation about what kind of relationship you want to have. I can't speak to, sort of the broad cultural milieu in North America, because of course there's also like this, right-wing reactionary movement happening, that, is, so I can't, it's hard to say which way the pendulum is really swinging. But I will say that in the popular media that I'm exposed to, it's just, there's a lot more fluidity now than there was, and certainly more familiarity with ideas of non-monogamy and different kinds of non-monogamy. The first edition of More Than Two was featured in the Netflix series You a couple of years ago. I didn't watch it, but apparently it was also kind of just used as, I can't remember, it was not a healthy portrayal of non-monogamy at all. But, so yeah.
What?
And I will just say, I want to give a plug for the Netflix series Sense8, which is the best non-monogamous and honestly queer representation I think I've ever seen on screen. So
I'll check it out.
Yeah.
What, either in your experience or if you want to generalize other people's experience, sort of the converse of a question I asked you earlier, what do you find the most rewarding parts of non-monogamy are compared to, monogamy?
Honestly, I would say that it really shows up in my friendships, because I have the freedom to let all of my relationships sort of grow and be whatever they are going to be, to explore.
Your romantic relationship.
Well, so this is part of being a relationship anarchist is I don't necessarily draw clear lines. So, it can be difficult for me to discuss, my, sort of my relationships, because I'm like, well, there's this person and they're sort of more than what you would consider a friend, but they're not exactly what most people would consider a partner, but I consider them a partner, but it's like, so, and that's the thing is for me, it has, it's erased a lot of those lines. And so it's let me explore different kinds of intimacy, different kinds of support, different kinds of just relationships that don't fit into any of these boxes. And the thing is with we talk in, I think, chapter 1 and More Than Two about defining partnership. And one of the things there's a section I'd like to read,
yes,
just a
please.
paragraph. Very strictly speaking, the only things that set non-monogamous relationships apart from monogamous ones are sex and romantic love, because having sex or falling in love with someone other than one's partner is implicitly a violation of the monogamous contract. But mononormativity, at least as we know it in the white North American context, usually also prescribes that many or all of the other elements we've listed above, intimacy, attachment, non-sexual physical touch, various forms of life entwinement and care commitments, are also off limits with others when we are in a monogamous relationship. Adopting a non-monogamous framework makes room for all these variations, not just sex, and so can expand the possibilities for our friendships too.
There was a sentence in your book there's many sentences that I thought were lovely. One in particular, which I thought was quite enchanting, was you wrote, "Part of the beauty of non-monogamous relationships is they can look like almost anything the people involved want them to." And I thought that, combined with the do what you like as long as you do no harm principle, was just a really beautiful conception of what not only relationships, but what navigating the world can look like.
Mm.
And I was just wondering if you could, expand on that or share with us why or what the impetus behind that sentiment was, because I just thought that was such a lovely phrase.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like we've talked about. We've grown up with these templates of what relationships are supposed to look like. So there's mononormativity, there's amatonormativity. So mononormativity tells us that, a monogamous relationship is the best and ideal kind of relationship. Amatonormativity tells us that falling in love, being in love, romantic love is the best kind of love, and we should want to fall in love, and we should seek that and honor that kind of love outside of any other kind of love. And the relationship escalator tells us that once we are in love with our monogamous partner, we go through certain steps, and that is what a successful and healthy relationship looks like. And the kind of non-monogamy that we talk about in More Than Two is really about sort of casting off all of that and looking at what enriches our lives, what we want in relationships, what feels good to us, what is nurturing for us and for the other person, and cultivating, crafting relationships that feed us in whatever ways we want to be fed. And here I want to give a plug too for another book, which is the book Sad Love by Carrie Jenkins, which is probably my favorite relationship book of all time. And she introduces the idea of eudaimonic love, which is as sort of a counterpoint to romantic love, and eudaimonic relationships as a counterpoint to romantic relationships, which is relationships that help provide meaning to your life. And she argues that we could be looking at meaning as the measure of a good relationship instead of happiness. That's why it's called Sad Love. And so
that's really interesting.
Yeah. So I feel like it's a good, these two books together, More Than Two Second Edition and Sad Love, are a little,
read them as compendiums.
Yeah. They're good companions. And I will say I've been heavily influenced by Carrie Jenkins' work. So yeah.
We're getting close to the end of our interview, but I didn't want to end without asking you about another passage that I found really interesting. Was that you wrote, some other authors have written about how compulsory monogamy and later amatonormativity is in North America has served as one prong of colonialism and capitalism.
Mm.
That's packed full of meaning, and I was wondering if you could unpack that for me and our listeners. How has compulsory monogamy and amatonormativity served to support colonialism and capitalism? Small question, I know.
Yeah, well, and I'm gonna mention another book by Carrie Jenkins again. She has a little book that I published called Non-Monogamy and Happiness, and she goes into that in that book and also summarizes some of the research and other writing about that. And I also want to mention Kim Tallbear, who wrote the foreword to More Than Two Second Edition, who has been writing for more than a decade at this point about the role of mononormativity and what she calls settler sexuality as a prong of colonialism. So these are not our ideas. They're, again, this is a synthesis of what we have learned. But let me see if I can speak to that and kind of sum up. First of all, a big part of colonialism required breaking apart traditional kinship networks and families. And that was, an explicit goal of the residential school system, for example, as well as many aspects of the Indian Act, for example. And so, the colonial settler society could not have indigenous communities functioning the way they used to. They needed to break them up, atomize them, and sort of assimilate them into the kind of society that the settlers were bringing. There's a book called by Sarah Carter called "The Importance of Being Monogamous" that actually talks about the process of imposing compulsory monogamy in the Canadian West during the 19th and early 20th centuries as part of the project of nation building and breaking up non-monogamous families, both among Indigenous people and among certain groups of settlers, and in order to impose the monogamous family norm. Amatonormativity is more recent, I think, and amatonormativity and capitalism. And one of the reasons I'm hesitant is because Carrie Jenkins does talk about this so much more eloquently in Non-Monogamy and Happiness. And so I kind of feel like I'm going to be paraphrasing her a little bit. But basically, the idea that marriage and monogamous marriage should be about romantic love, and that, lifelong romantic love, was largely part of a sort of social fairy tale that has been constructed over the last 100 years or so. And part of it is to isolate the nuclear family as a unit, both a productive and a consumptive unit of capitalism.
Easily exploited unit.
And exactly. And isolation, social isolation, is such a core component of the way that capitalism functions. And so if you sort of cordon people off into these romantic dyads and say, this is, you are going to put all of your focus into this relationship, this is where you're getting all your touch, all your intimacy, all your support, all your care, it isolates people, right? And that makes people more exploitable.
Fascinating. I never thought about that. That's a great explanation. I would be remiss if we ended the interview without talking about the beautiful cover on the book. If you could talk a little bit about that, because it's quite gorgeous.
Yeah, I have two people to thank for that. One is so the cover artist, Eugenia Zoloto. She is a Ukrainian artist in Kiev, and I actually found her on Instagram. She's a paper cut artist, and she's incredible. And so her name is on the copyright page, and so I would recommend that people go find her Instagram and follow her. She does animations. She's done a couple of I've licensed a couple of her works for catalog covers for Thornapple. And she also has an Etsy. So if you want to buy cards or originals or anything like that. The other person is Jeff Werner, who's the cover designer, who worked on the typography and that lovely embossing and the placement. And that was a much trickier job than you might expect, especially given how picky I was about how I wanted the cover to be. So I think he went through something like 27 iterations before we got to the one we got. So, yeah.
Well, your pickiness was amply rewarded because it's quite beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, Eve, thank you so much. The book is More Than Two, Cultivating Non-Monogamous Relationships with Kindness and Integrity by Eve Rickert and Andrea Zanin.
Could I pause you and have you?
Well, Eve, thank you so much. The book is More Than Two, second edition, Cultivating Non-Monogamous Relationships with Kindness and Integrity by Eve Rickert and Andrea Zanin. We proudly sell it here at Camus Books, so stop by 2620 Quadrasheet and buy Eve's book. Eve, thank you so much for sitting down with Seeds of Revolution. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Like you threatened he will. Which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want that some people, they just deserve to die. If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown?